Hi students, it's Ms.Boley here. In this video, my plan is to show you the process that I worked through to paint this realistic sort of still life of a collection of objects that were symbolic of my daughter. I do still have some little changes and edits that I want to make on this painting. I just keep noticing more things, but this is kind of like the final product for now. So I'm going to show you all the mistakes I made so that you don't have to make them, and I'm going to provide some tips for completing this assignment. So let's get started. For your reference photo, it's a good idea to only have one light source. I had several light sources because this was by the window and also I had turned on the light overhead, and it created really confusing shadows. As you can see here in the where the timer is here, it has like two different shadows. And also there was some that I was noticing when I was looking super close up at these beads, that they had shadows going in two different directions. So try to have your light source coming in just one direction if possible, and use natural light if you can. So try to go outside or go by a window. We talked about these kind of compositional rules when you're taking your photos, so try to keep these in mind. And then take a lot of different photos. This is only a few of the photos that I took. Try some different compositions as well. As you can see in these images, I had something really specific in mind. So my compositions are not that different, but just try something different. There's no harm if you just take a photo and you end up not liking it. You don't end up having to use it, right? So try to take a whole bunch of different ones so that you have lots of different options. And then you can always adjust if you don't have perfect conditions like natural lighting and stuff like that. We obviously can't have the perfect conditions all the time. So you can always adjust using software, and usually your device, if you're using your phone, will have a lot of different options for just editing the photo itself, like increasing the brightness and the contrast and shadows and highlights and all of that. It can also be helpful to convert your image into grayscale for when you do your underpainting. So I converted it to grayscale and then I printed it out for reference. All right, let's talk about materials. So I suggested in our material list to purchase acrylic paints with two reds, so a warm and cool red, two blues, a warm and cool blue, and then a warm and cool yellow, and then black and white. This is kind of like the general general color list for people that want to paint things realistically. I think that it's a lot easier to paint using fewer colors. So that's why I had this kind of limited to the primary colors and then black and white. I didn't end up using, because of the colors that I had in my photograph, I didn't end up using the cool yellow or the warm blue hardly at all. And that's just my preference. I think I do really like that cool blue. The phthalo blue is like my favorite. So I didn't end up using those paint tubes. So if you're wanting to save, you may not want to buy all of these. I also didn't use black very much. Um, but just, work with what you have. If you're not able to go out and buy a bunch of new materials, just work with what you have at home. I also used gesso to prepare my surface, which is not necessary, but it's really helpful to do. Even with canvases that come pre-gessoed, as they all do, adding another layer of gesso is really helpful to smooth out your surface. Since we're trying to do realism, having a smooth surface is really important. And then I use this stuff called acrylic medium. This is a glazing medium, so it's what you mix with your paint to make it kind of thinned out and lighter. You can just use water if you want, but acrylic medium is a helpful thing to try out. All right, and you'll also need a painting surface. So I chose to use a wood board. You could use a canvas, you could use a piece of cardboard, you could even use paper, as I did with my watercolor paper there. But preferably a canvas or the cradled board. I chose the board rather than the canvas because it's smoother, and I knew that I would need the smoothest surface possible. So that's why I picked that option. It's also nice to have some space where you can spread out your stuff too. All right, now it's time to go prep your surface. I'm going to use this gesso, and then I'm going to add some color into the gesso because I really don't like painting on a white blank canvas. I feel like the white specks underneath always show through, and I don't like that. So I like to cover all of the white area with some type of colored ground. Usually I use a warm color. It depends on the reference photo, but for me, in my reference photo, I knew that it was a lot of warm colors, so I chose orange, but then I was really nervous to make it too dark, so I went with kind of like a neutral, very, very light orange. It ended up being very similar to the color of the wood. So that was not on purpose. So now my surface is ready. Now I want to create my drawing so that I can then transfer it onto my surface. You may not choose to do this. If you don't, that's totally fine. This is what I prefer to do because I don't know, I get nervous about making mistakes and stuff when I'm um, placing the objects and blocking in and stuff. So I like to have these guides. So what I did was I got a sheet of paper that was the same size as my uh, painting surface. So it was 10 inches by 10 inches. I just got a piece of computer paper and I sketched out my still life on the paper. And I did include information about where the shadows and highlights and stuff were. And then I used this method to transfer my work onto my painting surface. So I used graphite and I scribbled on the back of my drawing using the graphite. And then I taped my drawing with the graphite on the back onto my canvas, as you see in step 2. And then I traced over my drawing using any drawing tool will do. A pen is great, or a hard lead pencil. And then your drawing will magically be transferred onto your painting surface when you lift it up. It's a good idea to lift it up and check periodically to make sure that it's actually working like it's supposed to. So here was the result. I have a faint outline of the objects. I can use this as my guideline when I'm painting. And now we will do the underpainting ground. Work from dark to light. So I'm starting with my very darkest values and I'm using my reference image that is black and white. So rather than using black and white and just making it black and gray, full grayscale, I'm going to try to incorporate some warm colors for my underpainting so that those can show through uh, and I'm hoping to use a glazing technique on top of my underpainting. So what I've done was I've taken my phthalo blue and my crimson red, or my crimson red. So both of those are the bluish, that's the bluish cool red and the cool blue. And the green that's in the cool blue is going to kind of neutralize the red and turn it into like a very dark brown. And on camera, it looks pretty much black. So what I'm doing now is I am blocking in all of the areas that are really, really dark on my reference image. All right, so I have completed my darkest value, and now what I've done is I've mixed a lighter value by adding some of my warm red into my dark brown color that I've mixed. So there I am adding that warm red, and I'm creating a lighter value. So I'm basically just being systematic, or at least I'm trying to be systematic, and I'm working through the dark to light. So wherever I see very, very dark values, I block those in first, then the light, and then I try to blend those together so that I can get kind of a smoother gradient. So you'll see me right now adding in that like light brown, lighter brown, kind of like a burnt sienna. And I'm adding some white in here. And at this point, you'll see me switch from, rather than working throughout the whole painting, I start kind of focusing object by object. I usually paint the whole painting at once. Like I do all the dark values, then all the next dark values, then the next darkest, then the next darkest. But the paint was drying really fast for me, and I was having trouble with blending. And so I wanted to be able to blend more easily. So I started working just on one object at a time. Look carefully at your reference image when painting. It might even be a good idea to zoom into the image and print or save several zoomed in images of specific parts. So because I was working from this printed out image and my printer is not super good quality, and honestly the image wasn't that great of quality either, so I had challenges with the image that I was working from. And later in the video, and oftentimes you might see me like grabbing my laptop, that's because I'm trying to get a reference image that I can actually see the detail on better. So I suggest, if possible, like zooming in and printing out several zoomed in images, because it really, really helps. However, though, that brings me to my next tip about the underpainting. Remember that you will be painting over the underpainting for the most part, so it doesn't have to be super detailed. So I feel like I ended up making my underpainting way too detailed. So it ended up taking me about 70 minutes, just a little bit over an hour, to complete the underpainting, including the background. And I think that's too much. I think the underpainting is kind of like an impression of the image, right? It's just a map for the values. But because I really wanted to I guess, familiarize myself really well with the image. Um, that's why I put so much detail into my underpainting. I also wanted to try the glazing technique, which I'll talk more about later in the video. And so that's why I did so much detail in my underpainting. So also a note about the paint palette. So because this took me 70 minutes, I didn't do it in one sitting. So the paints that I had mixed dried up. Um, so some people like to use like a tray that they can, with a lid that they can put the lid on top to stop their paints from drying out. But I just I try to use like a tiny, tiny amount of paint so that if it does dry out, it's not a huge deal. Make sure that you mix enough paint to cover the whole area that you're planning to cover. It's easier said than done. So because I was working with such small amounts of paint, this is a small canvas too. It's only 10 inches by 10 inches. But because I was working with such a small amount of paint, I had the problem where I would often run out of paint before I finished painting an area. This was especially frustrating when I was doing things like when I was doing like all the dark values or all the mid-tone values. Then I would mix my mid-tone value and then I would run out of that. So it's easier said than done. It's really hard to like to estimate how much paint you're going to need. But if you're being systematic, if you're working through from like dark to mid to like a lighter mid to light to highlight, then try to mix enough to last you for all of those particular areas. Paint the background first. So this goes for both the underpainting and once you actually get going onto the final painting, I guess. In the underpainting stage, though, it is debatable if you even need to paint the background. So I ended up painting my whole background using this like purple and blue. I'm not sure why I did that. I wanted to kind of explore using these undertones of purple and blue and see how they show up in my painting if I had them underneath. But then I thought, it doesn't really make sense because none of the objects have, like, they kind of do have that purplish tone occasionally, but I don't know. I just thought it was kind of confusing and weird, so I decided to paint over my background. And this wasted a lot of time for me. I don't think that it's necessary maybe to paint the background. As long as you're including the shadows, you can then just paint, like we already have a ground. We don't need another background color. Um, so perhaps you don't need to paint the background. If you are going to paint the background in your underpainting, then do it first rather than last, like I did. I often will paint the background last in a painting as like a reductive method, kind of, so that I can like carve out the forms. But with a realistic painting, we don't we don't really need to do that because we've spent a lot of time perfecting the forms and stuff prior. So just paint the background first. A good rule of painting is just to work from background to foreground. Now I'm ready to paint using color. Work from dark to light. Unfortunately, when I was painting with color for my photorealistic still life, a lot of my footage got deleted because my phone died while filming. Unfortunately, I just kind of forgot that I was filming and let it go for like 2 hours and it ran out of batteries. So I'm going to use this this video that I made doing a study of watermelons, just to show how we start to add color to our underpainting. So as you can see, I started out with the dark shadow areas, which I could tell where they were because they were the darkest areas on my underpainting. I then added a dark red to that area. And then same with the midtones, I added midtone red to that area. You can see on my palette, I've mixed kind of like 3 different values of red, and I am adding those areas to my underpainting where I can see uh, the dark, medium, and light values on my underpainting. And then blending. When blending, try to do it when the paint is wet. There's a variety of techniques that you can use to blend. My favorite is to paint the 2 areas that I want to blend, and then I clean my brush and I use that clean wet brush to blend the 2 colors together. You can also use a dry brush or a stippling technique. So I'm going to zoom in slightly so you can just see a little bit more of the blending technique. For this study, I wasn't doing as realistic, so I wasn't necessarily so concerned with blending, but you'll see how I'll paint an area, and then, so here I'm painting that area, that light area, then I'm painting that other light area. So I'm just blocking in some areas, and I will blend them after. I'm working pretty quickly. Then I'm cleaning my brush, and I'm using that brush to kind of feather out the edges um, of of that area. Sometimes if the paint is already dried, then I might have to go back over um, with those colors again. And here I am again, going over here, cleaning the brush, and then blending over top. And I found that those colors that I mixed there were much too light for what I actually needed. And they're much more pink, right? Where the watermelon is red. Step back from your painting frequently. I thought of this tip while I was painting the little beads in my still life. So I was using a Q-tip and I was kind of like adding the circles of paint. I had done a mid-tone red for my kind of base color. And then I started painting in these little red highlights. And I was like, this looks so bad. These don't look dimensional at all. I was grabbing my computer, I was zooming into the reference images, trying to find like what detail would make it look better. And I was just getting so frustrated. So I really strongly suggest that you take a step back from your work, because once I took a step back, I was like, "Oh no, those do look three-dimensional actually." They're actually the my one of my favorite parts of the painting, the beads. But I was getting super frustrated. So if you find yourself getting to the point of frustration, take a step back and look at it from far away, and you'll probably be really impressed with how it looks. If not, then just take a break. And when you come back the next day, you might be happier with it. You might be not happier with it. But honestly, some of the most important learning that we're going to do is when we struggle like this, when we have these productive struggles where we have the skills, we know what to do, we're just testing out and seeing what happens. That's how we learn the most. So remind yourself of that every time that you're feeling annoyed. You can use the glazing technique to leave your underpainting slightly visible. So there were certain objects in my still life where they were super fluorescent, and I knew I wouldn't be able to mix that fluorescent color using the paints that I had. Fluorescent colors are just different. They have some type of pigment in them that just it does something with the light differently than the regular paints. So I had these fluorescent craft paints from the dollar store, and I thought, I wonder if they're transparent enough that I can paint over certain spots like this bear and like the controllers on the Switch, and I could leave my underpainting visible. So that's what I'm doing here. I ended up just painting multiple layers of paint onto the bear until it kind of softened out as much of the underpainting as possible and looked kind of more 3D. Use multiple thin layers instead of thick layers of paint. So this is a good time to talk about using thin layers rather than thick layers. So if you're using thick layers and you're getting like that impasto where you're getting bumps um, from the paint, and because I was using that high viscosity paint, it does create bumps really easily. So you want to kind of try to use thinner layers so that it's easier to blend and you're not having bumps that you're having to deal with that make things kind of like take you out of the illusion of the three dimensionality. So with this fluorescent paint, because it's so thin, I did have to use multiple layers of it. So rather than kind of like thickly just gobbing it on, I did a thin layer, let it dry, did another thin layer, let it dry. This also let me like layer up certain areas to make them more vibrant, and other areas to make them less vibrant, like areas that are in shadow. I thought we could zoom in on this one as well, just to see how I'm going to paint the lipstick tube here. So I am using kind of like a mid red value. It's mostly the cool red mixed with probably some yellow, some of the warm yellow. And I'm just painting it watered down a little bit over top of the underpainting. So you can still see those shadows and highlights that I had done in the underpainting. And then in order to kind of get the highlights a little bit more highlighty, I'm going to add some lighter paint on top, and then you'll see me blend them. So this is the glazing technique. So when you're painting over an area using a thinned out acrylic paint, either mixed with acrylic medium, so it's more transparent, or mixed with water, that is called glazing. I feel like I didn't explain that earlier in the video. You can use the glazing technique to tone down highlights. So this highlight on the corner of the Nintendo Switch was super subtle on the reference image. I mixed a pink color and I used that for my highlights, but it was too bright because the plastic was not shiny. It's more of a matte plastic. So I needed to tone down that highlight. So then I glazed over it. So I basically just painted over it with the fluorescent pink color mixed with some of that acrylic medium to tone it down. So as you can see right here, I did that. I also did glazing over top of this shadow here. And I also did it on this shadow around the edge of the bear and on several of the highlights on the bear too. Okay, so my final tip is to pay attention to the details. So at this point, I felt like I was done. I ended up making a bunch more changes though, but I decided to glaze kind of like a light pink glaze over top of my painting so that I could kind of warm everything up and brighten everything up a bit. And then also, don't forget about the edges. I thought it would be cool to have like a pop of red on the edges. So my final tip is to pay attention to the details. And then if you do have some acrylic medium, it doesn't hurt to do kind of like a coat of that on after you're done everything. So this is how it turned out. There are still a couple edits that I want to make, like to the shadow behind the timer there. But overall, I'm pretty happy with the results. Thanks for watching.